When Abraham was still called Abram, the city of Ur was still one of the most influential urban centers of ancient Mesopotamia. Its ziggurat temples, canals, and intense trade reflected a society organized around Sumerian polytheism, where daily life was measured by the will of deities like Nana, the moon god. There, in the midst of that deeply religious and established culture, Abram grew up as part of a family dedicated to labor and commercial exchange, unaware that he would be called to break with everything known. The biblical tradition preserved that God spoke to Abram with an order that would completely change the course of his life. "Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you." In a time when identity was deeply tied to clan and territory, that command challenged all social structures. The promise that accompanied the order was equally extraordinary. God would make him a great nation, bless him, and multiply his descendants. Abram heard that voice and decided to respond with obedience, a gesture that set him apart from any other figure of his time. Together with his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, Abram left Ur. The journey first took him to Haran, a city located on the trade route connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia and Syria. Haran was also an important religious center for the worship of the moon, similar to that of Ur, which explained his family's presence there. However, the divine calling was not pointing to that region. After the death of his father, Terah, Abram heard the instruction to continue toward a destination he still did not know. It was then that he embarked on the journey to Canaan. The journey to the west took him through arid lands, fertile valleys, and scattered settlements. Canaan, a multicultural strip disputed between Egyptians and Mesopotamians, was inhabited by various peoples: Amorites, Jebusites, Canaanites, and Hittites, who established independent city-states. When Abram arrived in Shechem, he built an altar there, marking his recognition of the God who was guiding him. He then continued to Bethel, where he once again invoked the divine name, showing a faith that was built through concrete actions rather than speeches. But his stay in Canaan was not easy. A severe famine struck the region, forcing Abram to temporarily move to Egypt, a land where the Nile ensured abundance even in times of crisis. His stay in Egypt was marked by tensions that put both Abram and Sarai at risk, but it also revealed how even human decisions, whether right or wrong, did not nullify the promise that had been made. When he returned to Canaan, Abram found a disputed land and difficulties in coexisting with Lot, whose livestock and possessions were already too vast to share the same lands. They decided to part ways, and Lot chose the fertile plains of the Jordan, while Abram remained in the mountainous region. It was at this moment that God reaffirmed his covenant. He promised him all the land that he could see from those hills, and innumerable descendants, and a future where his lineage would extend from generation to generation. The covenant was sealed with a solemn ritual. According to the biblical account, Abram prepared animals cut in half, and during the night a divine presence symbolized as a smoking oven and a blazing torch passed between them, a gesture that in ancient times indicated the ratification of an irreversible commitment. In this covenant, God guaranteed the possession of the land from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, laying the foundations for the identity of a people that did not yet exist as such. Despite the difficulties, Abram continued to build altars and mark with his presence the places where he had received divine promises. His days unfolded among shepherds, seasonal migrations, and tensions with neighboring peoples. Still, each movement reinforced the idea that his life was guided by a purpose beyond his control. It was then that God announced to him that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, a message that contrasted with the reality that Sarai was still barren. Abram's faithfulness was recorded as an essential trait of his character. Though he did not understand how every aspect of the promise would come to pass, he continued to move through the land as a stranger, trusting that that word had a future ahead. The narrative portrayed him as the first patriarch of a lineage that would one day become Israel, the chosen nation. Thus came the moment when his personal story would begin to intersect with the deepest family tension he would ever know. The birth of Ishmael and the announcement that the promise against all logic would fall upon a son born of Sarai. Abraham, Sarah, and Ishmael, conflicts and decisions that shaped history. Time passed over Abram and Sarai's tents, and the silence of motherhood did not correspond to the magnitude of the promise that had been made to them. Infertility in the ancient East was seen as a social and spiritual burden, a sign of shame that particularly fell on the woman. Sarai lived with this weight, aware that the promise of numerous descendants seemed increasingly distant. In that cultural context, offering a maidservant as a substitute was a common practice to ensure an heir. Thus, Sarai presented Hagar, her Egyptian maidservant, as the solution that would, at least outwardly, fulfill the destiny spoken by God. Abram accepted the proposal, trying to reconcile the divine promise with the human mechanisms available. Hagar's pregnancy immediately altered the family dynamic. The maidservant, now pregnant, adopted a superior attitude toward her mistress, as sometimes happened in societies where a woman's value was measured by her ability to bear children. Sarai interpreted this attitude as an offense and turned to Abram to restore order within their home. The conflict once again revealed that decisions made to help the promise ended up generating tensions that would mark the future history of the people of Israel. Hagar endured such strong pressures that she decided to flee into the desert. On the way near a water spring, she experienced a divine appearance that changed her destiny. The angel of the Lord assured her that her son would be called Ishmael, God hears, because God had heard her affliction. The promise for him was also significant. He would be the father of a great lineage. However, his character would be untamable, like a man accustomed to the desert, and he would live in conflict with his brothers. That description anticipated the role of the Ishmaelite peoples in ancient history. Free clans, nomadic, hard to subdue, and in constant tension with agricultural settlements. Hagar returned to Abram's household and gave birth to Ishmael. For a time it seemed that the promise could be fulfilled through him. Abram even thought that God would establish his covenant with this son born outside of his marriage to Sarai. However, the years continued to pass, and when Abram reached 99 years old, he received a revelation that would completely alter his expectations. God reaffirmed that the promise would not fall upon Ishmael, but upon a son who would be born from Sarai despite her advanced age. It was at that moment that Abram's name was changed to Abraham, father of a multitude, and Sarai's name to Sarah, princess, indicating a different destiny, governed more by divine intervention than by biological logic. Circumcision was established as the sign of the covenant, a visible mark on the body that would separate their descendants from other peoples and seal the perpetual commitment between God and Abraham. When Abraham heard that Sarah would have a son, he fell on his face and laughed. The idea that a 90-year-old woman could conceive was unimaginable even in an era accustomed to extraordinary tales. However, the promise insisted that Isaac would be the legitimate heir and that his lineage would carry the eternal covenant. God also confirmed that he would bless Ishmael, multiply his descendants, and make him a great nation. But he made it clear without ambiguity that the promise would pass through Isaac. The scene became even more defined when three visitors, presented in the narrative as divine beings, arrived at Abraham's tent in the oak groves of Mamre. While sharing a meal under the shade, they reiterated that Sarah would have a son the following year. From inside the tent, Sarah overheard those words and also laughed. Their laughter marked a contrast between human disbelief and divine purpose, but it also reflected the surprise of a future that could no longer be sustained by rational explanations. Meanwhile, Ishmael grew as the firstborn of Abraham and part of the family structure. His presence represented the alternative path that Abraham and Sarah had taken, an attempt to solve, by their own means, what the promise had signaled in a different way. However, that attempt did not annul the destiny that had been assigned to them. The tension between accepting Ishmael as a son and the expectation for the promised son became a fragile balance that would sooner or later be broken. The story progressed until the announcement was fulfilled. Against all expectations, Sarah conceived and gave birth to Isaac. It was then that the coexistence between the two sons became untenable. The biblical narrative mentions an episode in which Sarah saw Ishmael mocking or interacting with Isaac in a way that she interpreted as a threat to the inheritance of the child. This led her to demand the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael to the desert. Abraham, deeply disturbed by this decision, received divine instructions that led him to accept the separation. God reiterated that he would care for Ishmael, but confirmed that the line of the covenant would continue through Isaac. Hagar and Ishmael wandered through the desert of Beersheba until the water ran out. In a moment of despair, when Hagar feared seeing her son die, an angel intervened once again. He showed her a well and reaffirmed the promise that Ishmael would be the father of a strong nation. Ishmael grew in the desert, became an archer, and settled in the region of Paran, where Hagar took for him an Egyptian wife, thus marking the cultural origin of many of the peoples traditionally linked to his lineage. The paths of Isaac and Ishmael were permanently separated, and although the biblical narrative suggests that they later reunited to bury Abraham, their trajectories already represented different destinies. The story had been marked by a family conflict that gave rise to two lineages whose influence would extend for millennia. Isaac, the heir of the promise. Isaac grew under the shadow of a miracle. His birth, which occurred when Abraham and Sarah had lost all natural expectation of having descendants, was seen at the time as an unmistakable sign of divine intervention. The child inherited not only the name that evoked the laughter of his parents, but also the immense responsibility of upholding the continuity of a promise that had marked his family for decades. In the patriarchal tradition of the ancient East, the legitimate son not only secured the material inheritance, but also affirmed the spiritual identity of the clan. In Isaac fell all of that and more, the continuation of a lineage chosen to form a nation. The relationship between Abraham and Isaac became etched in one of the most intense episodes of the biblical narrative, the test on Mount Moriah. Isaac, carrying the wood, ascended the mountain with his father, unaware that he himself was the object of the sacrifice. The episode was narrated with a sobriety that reflected the tension of an act incomprehensible from any human perspective. Although tradition emphasized Abraham's obedience, it also hinted at Isaac's docility as he accepted being placed on the altar without recorded resistance. The divine intervention, halting the sacrifice and providing a ram, confirmed once again that the promise would not be interrupted. Isaac descended the mountain alive, the bearer of a destiny that had been directly protected. After Sarah's death, Abraham took care to ensure a suitable marriage for his son. In a society where family ties determined alliances, inheritances, and cultural belonging, choosing a wife from among the Canaanite peoples could dilute the emerging identity of the lineage. Therefore, Abraham sent his most trusted servant to the region of Aram Naharaim, the land of his ancestors, to find a wife who shared their origin. The narrative describes the scene at a well where Rebekah, a young woman of servant character, offered water to the servant and his camels, a gesture interpreted as a divine sign. The marriage between Isaac and Rebekah solidified the continuity of the lineage within the family framework, preserving both the ethnic and spiritual identity. However, for many years, the marriage faced the same obstacle that had marked the previous generation. Rebekah could not conceive. Isaac prayed for her, and the answer came in the form of a troubled pregnancy with such intense movements that Rebekah consulted God to understand what was happening. The response foreshadowed the future tension between two nations. Two nations are in your womb, and the older will serve the younger. The birth of the twins, Esau and Jacob, highlighted that contrast from the beginning. Esau emerged first, covered in hair and associated with the world of hunting and life in the field. Jacob was born immediately afterward, grasping his brother's heel, a gesture interpreted in antiquity as a sign of dispute. The legal birthright belonged to Esau, but the prophecy given before their birth had already directed the destiny toward Jacob. Isaac, as a father, led a life marked by stability and continuity. He lived in regions that his father had previously traveled through, reopening wells that the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham's death. In that society, wells were symbols of life, property, and prosperity, so disputes over them reflected territorial and economic tensions. Isaac sought to avoid direct confrontations and moved repeatedly until he found a place where there was no conflict, a gesture that tradition interpreted as a trait of his peaceful character. During a famine, Isaac moved to Philistine territory in Gerar, where he faced a situation similar to what Abraham had experienced in Egypt. Fearing for his life because of Rebekah's beauty, he declared that she was his sister. Although this act is questionable from a modern ethical perspective, it responded to common practices and fears in an environment where rulers could claim women and eliminate husbands. The deception was discovered, but King Abimelech allowed them to remain in the region and granted them protection. Despite the conflicts, Isaac prospered remarkably. His wealth, measured in flocks, servants, and productive fields, generated envy among the inhabitants of Gerar, leading to new disputes over wells. However, each move reaffirmed his commitment to peaceful coexistence, and finally, in Beersheba, he received a new divine confirmation. God appeared as the God of Abraham, assuring him that the promise continued in him and that his descendants would be as numerous as those of his father. Isaac built an altar in that place, marking his recognition of God's faithfulness. The relationship between Isaac and his sons intensified the prophesied tension. Isaac favored Esau, who provided him with game, while Rebekah preferred Jacob. This favoritism would mark the future history of the clan and create a fracture that would change the course of the lineage. Before Isaac could officially bless his firstborn, events would unfold in such a way that the birthright and blessing would fall upon the younger son, thus fulfilling what had been announced from Rebekah's womb. Jacob and Esau, rivalry, deception, and blessing. Isaac grew old in the midst of a life marked by stability and the continuity of the covenant. But his sons grew up following such different paths that family harmony became impossible. Esau, the firstborn, became an expert hunter, a man of the field appreciated for his strength and autonomy. Jacob, on the other hand, preferred to stay among the tents, attentive to the management of the household and the flocks. The difference was not only in character, but also in affinity. Isaac loved Esau for the game he brought him, while Rebekah had a special inclination for Jacob, whom she saw as the legitimate heir to the promise made during her pregnancy. The tension between the two brothers manifested in an episode that tradition recorded as decisive. One day, Esau returned exhausted from a day in the field and found Jacob preparing a red stew. Weary, he asked for a plate of food, and Jacob seized the opportunity to ask for the birthright in exchange, the most important family right, which implied leadership and a double inheritance. Esau, driven by the urgency of hunger and perhaps by an impulsive character, agreed to give up his birthright for a simple plate of lentils. Thus, the story reflected a symbolic surrender that anticipated future conflicts. The most tense moment of the story came when Isaac, old and with failing sight, decided to bestow the final blessing upon his firstborn. Rebekah, upon hearing this, acted swiftly. She convinced Jacob to disguise himself as Esau and receive the blessing meant for his older brother. She prepared a dish Isaac liked, dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes, and covered his arms and neck with skins to simulate the roughness of his brother's hair. Isaac hesitated when he heard Jacob's voice, but after feeling him and smelling the clothes, he believed he was facing Esau. The blessing fell upon Jacob, abundance, dominion, and the subjugation of peoples and brothers. When Esau came with his food, the truth came to light. Isaac trembled deeply, aware that the blessing could not be undone. Esau wept bitterly and asked for a blessing, but he only received words indicating a hard life, marked by the sword and a fate of occasional servitude. The rivalry between them turned into hatred, and Esau swore to kill Jacob when his father died. Rebekah, upon hearing this threat, sent Jacob to her brother Laban's house in Haran, under the pretext that he needed to find a wife from his own kin. Jacob began his journey north, alone and vulnerable. Along the way, he had a dream that would profoundly shape his destiny. As he lay on a stone, he saw a ladder stretching from the earth to the sky, with angels ascending and descending. At the top, God reiterated the promises made to Abraham and Isaac. Jacob would inherit the land where he slept. His descendants would be as numerous as the dust of the earth, and all the families of the world would be blessed through him. Upon waking, Jacob set up a pillar and named the place Bethel, House of God, committing to acknowledge the God who had revealed himself to him. When he arrived in Haran, Jacob met Rachel, Laban's daughter, by a well. She offered him water and took him to her family. Laban welcomed him warmly, but quickly saw in Jacob an opportunity to benefit from his work. They agreed that Jacob would work for 7 years to marry Rachel. However, at the end of the 7 years, Laban deceived him and gave him Leah, the older sister, justifying it with local customs. Jacob had to work another 7 years for Rachel, and the tension between the two sisters would mark the early years of family life. The rivalry between Leah and Rachel over motherhood became one of the central themes of the story. Leah easily conceived children, while Rachel struggled with infertility. In this competition, both gave their maidservants to Jacob to bear children in their name, replicating earlier family patterns. Over time, 12 sons and 1 daughter, Dinah, were born. Jacob's sons would become the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel, distributed among Leah, Rachel, and the maidservants Bilhah and Zilpah. The family grew amid tensions, shifting alliances, and episodes that reflected the human complexity of the clan. During this time, Jacob prospered greatly under Laban's supervision, although Laban repeatedly tried to manipulate his wages and working conditions. Jacob's skill in managing flocks and his cunning allowed him to build a considerable fortune. When the tension with Laban became unbearable, Jacob decided to flee with his family and livestock, repeating the displacement pattern that had marked his lineage. On his way back to Canaan, Jacob faced a decisive moment. Fearing the encounter with Esau, he sent messengers and gifts in advance to calm his brother's anger. The night before the meeting, Jacob had another mysterious encounter. He wrestled with a being whose identity was not clearly defined in the story, although tradition recognizes it as a divine messenger. At dawn, the being blessed him and changed his name to Israel, the one who struggles with God, marking a new stage in his life and in the future identity of the people. The encounter with Esau, contrary to expectations, did not end in violence. Esau embraced him, accepted the gifts, and allowed them both to go their separate ways. Jacob finally settled in the land of Canaan, where the story would soon turn to one of his younger sons, Joseph, whose destiny would completely transform the family's life. Joseph, from slave to governor of Egypt. The story of Joseph stands as one of the most detailed and dramatic in the patriarchal tradition. The son of Jacob and Rachel, Joseph was born in his father's old age, which sparked a particular affection for him. Jacob distinguished him with a long, multicolored tunic, a garment that suggested status and favoritism. This gesture, though paternal and affectionate, immediately heightened the tension with his older brothers, who saw in Joseph not only a favorite but also a potential privileged heir. The situation worsened when Joseph began recounting dreams that seemed to announce his future dominance. In one, the sheaves of his brothers bowed before his own. In another, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. In a setting where dreams were interpreted as divine messages, these stories were seen as an intolerable threat. Envy turned into resentment, and resentment into open hatred. Joseph's brothers no longer saw him as a naive young man, but as a rival who needed to be eliminated. The turning point came when Jacob sent Joseph to oversee the condition of his brothers and their flocks. They saw him approaching from a distance and before he arrived conspired to kill him. Reuben, the oldest, intervened to prevent a direct murder and suggested throwing him into an empty cistern with the secret plan of rescuing him later. While Joseph lay in the cistern, a group of Ishmaelite merchants heading toward Egypt appeared on the horizon. It was Judah who suggested selling Joseph instead of killing him. That transaction, carried out for 20 pieces of silver, determined the course of the story. The brothers deceived Jacob by presenting him with the tunic soaked in goat's blood, making him believe that Joseph had been devoured by a wild animal. Jacob wept inconsolably while Joseph was taken to Egypt, a rising power whose life depended on the Nile, state administration, and a centralized economy, in stark contrast to the nomadism of the patriarchs. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. There, his organizational skills led him to manage his master's household. However, his rise provoked another crisis. Potiphar's wife became attracted to him and repeatedly attempted to seduce him. When rejected, she falsely accused him of attempting to assault her. Joseph was imprisoned, a victim of an injustice that reflected the vulnerability of a foreigner in foreign lands. In prison, Joseph again stood out for his integrity and ability. The prison warden entrusted him with overseeing the prisoners, and this led him to meet 2 of Pharaoh's officials, the cupbearer and the baker. Both had troubling dreams, and Joseph, insisting that interpretations belonged to God, explained their meanings. The cupbearer would be restored to his position, the baker would be executed. The events unfolded exactly as Joseph had foretold, but the cupbearer, once restored, forgot to mention Joseph to Pharaoh. 2 years passed before Pharaoh had disturbing dreams: 7 fat cows devoured by 7 lean ones, and 7 plump ears of grain consumed by 7 thin ones. No magician or wise man in the palace could interpret them. That's when the cupbearer remembered Joseph. The young Hebrew was brought out of prison, cleaned up, and taken before Pharaoh. With humility, Joseph clarified that the interpretation did not come from him, but from God. He announced that Egypt would face 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine. He recommended storing grain during the years of prosperity to survive the future crisis. The proposal impressed Pharaoh, who recognized in Joseph exceptional wisdom and a remarkable spirit. He appointed him governor of Egypt, second in authority only to himself. Joseph was given an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, and an Egyptian wife, Asenath, with whom he had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. During the years of abundance, he organized the storage of grain in strategic cities. When famine struck the region, Egypt was prepared, and entire nations came to buy food. Among those who suffered from the shortage were Jacob and his sons. Upon learning that Egypt had grain, Jacob sent his sons, except for Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, to buy provisions. When they arrived before Joseph, they did not recognize him, although he immediately identified them. The cultural distance, Egyptian attire, and position of authority prevented them from imagining that the governor was their lost brother. Joseph greeted them sternly, accusing them of being spies, and subjected them to a series of tests designed to reveal their changed character. He demanded that they bring Benjamin to prove their honesty, kept Simeon as collateral, and sent grain back to Canaan. When Benjamin finally arrived, Joseph hid his cup in his sack to accuse him of theft and provoke a reaction from his brothers. It was Judah who demonstrated a profound change by offering himself as a slave in place of the young man, acknowledging their past guilt. That gesture led Joseph to reveal his identity with tears. He stated that although his brothers acted with malice, God had used their actions to preserve lives during the famine. Jacob and all his family moved to Egypt, settling in Goshen, a fertile region suitable for shepherds. Thus began the Israelites' stay in Egypt, initially in a context of protection and prosperity. Israel in Egypt, prosperity turned into slavery. The arrival of Jacob and his sons in Egypt marked an unexpected turn in the history of Abraham's lineage. Pharaoh, grateful for Joseph's wisdom and management, allowed the entire family to settle in the region of Goshen, a fertile area near the Nile Delta. There, Jacob's descendants found a favorable environment for livestock and population growth. The biblical account highlights that during Joseph's years, Israel prospered remarkably. They increased in number, strengthened their flocks, and adapted to the political and economic stability of the Egyptian empire. Joseph continued to manage the country's resources while the famine spread beyond Egypt. During this time, Pharaoh's policy was consolidated, whereby Egyptian farmers, lacking their own grain, gave up properties and services to the state in exchange for food. The country was reorganized in a centralized manner, with growing power in the hands of Pharaoh. This process allowed Joseph to maintain the effectiveness of the Egyptian administration, but it also transformed the social structure of the empire. As time passed, a slow but inevitable generational change took place. Joseph grew old, saw his sons Manasseh and Ephraim grow up, and witnessed the settlement of his family in the Egyptian land. Before he died, Joseph obtained a promise from his brothers that, when the time came, they would take his remains to the promised land, a gesture reflecting the constant expectation of a return to Canaan. His death marked the end of an era of protection, as the figure that had united Israel with Egyptian power vanished with him. Years passed, and the narrative states that a new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, arose in Egypt. Although the phrase does not necessarily imply literal ignorance, it signals a profound political change. Egyptian dynasties often experienced disruptions, invasions, or abrupt leadership changes, and a new ruler could reconfigure alliances or perceive threats where there had once been cooperation. Israel, now numerous and well-established, began to be seen as a different, growing, and potentially destabilizing ethnic group. The Pharaoh noticed that the Israelites were multiplying significantly. In a society where stability depended on labor and loyalty to the state, the growth of a foreign people raised suspicions. Fearing that in the event of war they might join Egypt's enemies, Pharaoh decided to impose forced labor upon them. Overseers were appointed to oppress them with heavy work, building storehouses, transporting materials, and participating in state projects. The cities of Pithom and Ramses were constructed with Israelite labor, highlighting the scale of the pharaonic works in which they participated. However, the more they were oppressed, the more they grew. The policy of pressure did not weaken the Israelites, rather it increased Pharaoh's concern. The response was to radicalize the oppression. The work became harsher, demanding the production of bricks, mixing clay and straw under strict supervision with no reduction in their daily quota. The endless workdays, the heat of the delta, and the discipline of the Egyptian overseers marked a period of suffering that transformed the everyday life of the people. Faced with the impossibility of halting their growth through forced labor, Pharaoh adopted more drastic measures. He ordered the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill the newborn boys during childbirth, sparing only the girls. This measure aimed to limit the military and reproductive capacity of the people without provoking an immediate reaction from the Egyptians. However, the midwives, fearing God, disobeyed and allowed the boys to live. When questioned, they argued that the Hebrew women were vigorous and gave birth before they arrived. Pharaoh, frustrated, then issued a more public decree: every male child born was to be thrown into the Nile. This mandate marked the darkest point of Egyptian rule over Israel. Families lived in constant fear, trying to hide their births and protect the most vulnerable. It was in this context that a woman from the tribe of Levi conceived a son and hid him for 3 months. Unable to protect him any longer, she made a papyrus basket coated with pitch and placed it among the reeds of the river. That desperate decision, motivated by the desire to preserve the child's life, would be the beginning of a national transformation. The birth of Moses, a promised deliverer. The oppression in Egypt had reached a critical point when the child destined to change the future of Israel was born. Pharaoh's decree ordered that all male babies be thrown into the Nile, aiming to break the demographic growth of the Hebrew people. In this climate of fear, a Levite woman gave birth to a son whose life directly challenged Egyptian authority. For 3 months, she managed to hide him, avoiding discovery by the overseers, but as the child grew, keeping him hidden became impossible. It was then that she decided to take a desperate measure that, unknowingly, would connect the child's fate to the heart of Egyptian power. She prepared a papyrus basket and waterproofed it with pitch and tar, following common techniques for making small boats in the delta. She placed the child inside and left the basket among the reeds on the banks of the Nile, hoping the current would not carry him away and that someone might find him. The child's sister Miriam stayed at a distance to observe what would happen. What followed was an unexpected twist that the biblical narrative presents as a providential intervention. Pharaoh's daughter went down to the river to bathe and discovered the basket. When she opened it, she saw the baby crying and felt compassion. Although it was evident that he was a Hebrew child, she did not hand him over to the guards nor execute the decree. Miriam approached and offered to find a Hebrew nurse, allowing the child's own mother to nurse him under royal protection. Thus, the child condemned to die ended up growing in the very household that had tried to save him. When he was weaned, his mother took him to the princess, who adopted him and gave him the name Moses, interpreted as drawn from the waters. Raised in the palace environment, Moses would have received a privileged education. Egypt was one of the most advanced cultural centers of the ancient Near East. Hieroglyphic writing, mathematics, state administration, monumental construction, and a sophisticated bureaucracy. A young person educated in that sphere acquired knowledge that no enslaved Hebrew could obtain. Later traditions suggested that Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, which would explain his ability to lead in later stages. However, even though he lived among the Egyptians, he never ceased to be aware of his Hebrew origins. The turning point in his life came when, as an adult, he witnessed the oppression of his people. One day he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Driven by indignation and a sense of justice, Moses intervened and killed the Egyptian, hiding the body in the sand. The next day he tried to mediate between 2 fighting Hebrews, but one of them revealed that he knew what had happened, making it clear that the act had not gone unnoticed. When Pharaoh learned of the incident, he sought to kill Moses. Faced with this imminent danger, Moses fled eastward, crossing the desert until he arrived in the land of Midian, where the story marked a new beginning. In Midian, Moses rested by a well, a strategic place for travelers and herders. There, he defended the daughters of a Midianite priest, Reuel, also called Jethro, who were being harassed by local shepherds. Grateful, Reuel welcomed him into his home and offered him his daughter Zipporah in marriage. Moses settled with them and worked as a shepherd far from the palatial life he had known. The contrast between the sophistication of Egypt and the nomadic simplicity of Midian marked a period of inner transformation. Moses had a son, Gershom, whose name reflected his condition as a foreigner, a stranger in a foreign land. While Moses lived in Midian, the situation in Egypt worsened. The Pharaoh who had sought his life had died, but the system of oppression remained intact. The Israelites cried out for deliverance, and the biblical narrative emphasized that God heard their cries and remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The story moved toward a decisive moment in which Moses' life would once again change radically. One day, while shepherding Jethro's flocks near Mount Horeb, Moses saw a bush that was burning but not consumed. Intrigued, he approached to observe it, and from the flame, he heard a voice calling his name. God revealed himself to him and commanded him to take off his sandals, for he was standing on holy ground. The revelation gave a clear mandate. Moses was to return to Egypt to free the Israelites. The mission seemed impossible. Moses claimed he was not the right person, feared he would not be believed, and mentioned his lack of eloquence. But each objection was answered. God gave him signs, promised his presence, and appointed his brother Aaron as his spokesperson. Moses' resistance eventually gave way, and he accepted the call. He returned to Egypt with his family, carrying with him the mission to confront Pharaoh with the message of liberation for the people. The man who had fled as a fugitive would now return as a representative of a higher authority, initiating a confrontation that would change the history of Egypt and Israel. The 10 plagues and the fall of Egyptian power. Moses returned to Egypt accompanied by Aaron, his older brother, who would serve as his spokesperson before Pharaoh. The Egyptian court remained a center of power, religiosity, and absolute authority. In this environment, the appearance of 2 Hebrews proclaiming a divine mandate was met with disdain. The message was direct: Israel must be freed to worship in the desert. Pharaoh responded by further intensifying forced labor and accusing the Hebrews of laziness. The confrontation, instead of being resolved with words, turned into a clash between Pharaoh's authority and the power of the God of the patriarchs. It was then that the signs began. Each of the 10 plagues served as both a symbolic and literal blow against the gods of Egypt, their sacred elements, and the economic structure of the empire. The first plague occurred when Moses and Aaron presented themselves before Pharaoh on the banks of the Nile. The river's water, considered the main source of life and a divine symbol, turned to blood. The fish died, and the river emitted an unbearable stench. For 7 days, the Egyptians searched for water by digging along the riverbanks, unable to use the river that defined their existence. The second sign was a massive invasion of frogs. These creatures, associated with fertility and protected by certain deities, multiplied uncontrollably. They entered houses, bedrooms, ovens, and utensils. Pharaoh asked Moses to remove them, but once the plague ceased, he hardened his heart again. The third and fourth plagues directly affected the population and the environment. First, a cloud of lice or mosquitoes covered both people and animals. Then, swarms of flies invaded the Egyptian cities, causing chaos and disrupting daily life. In these plagues, a crucial distinction arose. While the Egyptians suffered, the region of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, remained untouched. This differentiation marked a clear message. The divine hand intervened selectively. The fifth plague struck the Egyptian livestock. Horses, donkeys, camels, sheep, and oxen suddenly died, causing significant economic losses. In an agrarian society, the death of livestock meant a crisis in production and a deep wound to the prestige of Pharaoh, who was supposed to ensure the country's prosperity. Despite the disaster, Pharaoh refused to relent. The sixth plague affected the bodies of the Egyptians. Moses and Aaron took soot from a furnace and threw it into the air before Pharaoh. Immediately, painful sores appeared on both people and animals. The Egyptian magicians, who had previously attempted to replicate the initial signs, were unable to appear before Moses due to the boils. Their defeat symbolized the fall of the religious authorities that upheld the empire's ideology. The seventh plague introduced a destructive phenomenon: hail, accompanied by fire, a mixture that devastated the fields and destroyed the vegetation. The Egyptians who followed Moses' warning and sheltered people and animals survived. Those who did not lost much of their possessions. Pharaoh seemed to recognize his error and asked for the storm to cease, but once again he hardened his heart. The eighth plague brought locusts sent by an eastern wind. These insects covered the surface of the land and devoured everything that the hail had left behind. Pharaoh's advisors pleaded with him to relent, fearing the total collapse of the country, but Pharaoh's response remained partial and insufficient, and the plague continued until Moses interceded again. The ninth plague brought a thick darkness that covered Egypt for 3 days. It was not just an absence of light, but an oppressive sensation that paralyzed daily life. Homes stood still, activity ceased completely, and even the temples dedicated to Ra, the sun god, were engulfed in darkness. However, in Goshen there was light, once again marking the separation between oppressor and oppressed. The tension reached its peak with the 10th plague. God announced that death would visit the firstborns of Egypt, from the Pharaoh's heir to the children of slaves and the livestock. The Israelites received specific instructions to celebrate the first Passover, sacrifice a lamb, paint the doorposts of their houses with its blood, and remain indoors during the night. Those houses would be passed over, avoiding the judgment. When midnight came, a heartbreaking cry spread throughout Egypt. In every home there was a dead body. Pharaoh, struck personally and nationally, called for Moses and Aaron and ordered that the people leave the country immediately. The Egyptians, fearing further calamities, urged the Israelites to leave and gave them gold, silver, and clothing, fulfilling the ancient promise that Israel would not leave empty-handed. The exodus was swift and massive. Men, women, children, flocks, and possessions set off for the desert. After centuries of settlement, Israel left Egypt as a distinct people, united by the experience of oppression and divine intervention. The crossing of the Red Sea, the miracle that defined a nation. The departure from Egypt had been as sudden as it was dramatic. Israel moved through the desert without a clear path, guided only by the cloud pillar that rose during the day and the pillar of fire that illuminated the nights. These manifestations, recorded as visible signs of God's presence, provided direction and protection to the newly liberated people. However, liberation did not mean the end of danger. In the palaces of the Nile, Pharaoh reconsidered his decision and felt the economic weight of losing thousands of workers. The narrative shows how his heart was hardened again, and he ordered his chariots and horsemen to pursue the Israelites. The Egyptian pursuit was not hasty. Pharaoh's army, one of the most organized and feared in the ancient world, mobilized quickly. War chariots, cavalry, and trained soldiers advanced eastward, seeking to reach the Israelites before they could escape completely from Egypt's controlled territory. The Hebrews, upon seeing them approach, were trapped between the sea and the advancing military force. Panic seized the camp. Many reproached Moses, reminding him that they had warned about the consequences of defying Pharaoh. They preferred the known slavery to death by the Egyptian sword. Moses responded with a phrase that tradition preserved as a declaration of absolute trust. "Do not be afraid, stand firm and see the salvation that the Lord will accomplish for you today." It was a statement that defied all military logic. There were no weapons, walls, or escape routes. The people were completely exposed. However, the cloud pillar that had been guiding them changed position and stood between the Israelites and the Egyptians. The cloud darkened the vision of the pursuing army and created a separation that prevented immediate advance, while on the Israelite side the pillar continued to provide light. That night, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The narrative states that a strong east wind blew for hours, pushing the waters back and creating a dry path in the middle of the water. The phenomenon, described as miraculous, allowed the Israelites to advance between two walls of water toward the other shore. The people crossed hurriedly, carrying children, belongings, and flocks, aware that they were traversing a space as extraordinary as it was dangerous. The Egyptian army, upon seeing the open path, decided to pursue them. The chariots advanced between the walls of water, but soon the situation became chaotic. The wheels got stuck, the horses became uncontrollable, and the military formation lost cohesion. The biblical text suggests that panic overtook the soldiers when they believed they perceived divine intervention against them. As the Egyptians struggled to advance, the Israelites reached solid ground on the other side of the sea. It was then that Moses stretched out his hand again. The waters returned to their natural course, covering the soldiers and chariots trapped in the seabed. The power of the sea, which had been a path for Israel, became an instrument of destruction for Egypt. The Pharaoh, whose name is not mentioned in the narrative, became marked as the monarch whose obstinacy faced not only a people, but a higher will. The narrative asserts that not a single member of the army that pursued them survived. When Israel saw the bodies of the Egyptians washed up by the waves, they understood the magnitude of what had occurred. The immediate threat had disappeared. The people, who had doubted moments before, recognized Moses' leadership with fear and respect. In this context, a song was born, traditionally attributed to Moses and his sister Miriam. The hymn celebrated the victory, highlighted the divine power, and became one of the oldest poems preserved in the Bible. The crossing of the sea solidified Israel as a people separated from Egypt, not only geographically but spiritually as well. Unlike the patriarchal experiences, which had taken place in family clans and scattered territories, this episode involved an entire community united by a common and defining experience. The Exodus was no longer simply the escape of an oppressed group. It became the symbolic birth of a nation. After the celebration, Israel entered the desert of Shur, beginning a journey marked by scarcity, learning, and constant tensions between the newly acquired freedom and the uncertainty of the path ahead. The desert, trials, miracles, and spiritual formation. After crossing the sea, Israel moved towards the desert of Shur, an arid stretch where the newly obtained freedom faced the difficulties of an inhospitable territory. The initial euphoria of liberation quickly faded in the face of thirst. The people walked for 3 days without finding water until they reached Marah, where the water turned out to be bitter and undrinkable. Frustration erupted in complaints against Moses, reflecting a tension that would become recurrent throughout the journey. Moses cried out to God, who showed him a tree that, when thrown into the water, purified it. This scene underscored the pattern that would mark their experience in the desert: human need crying out, divine intervention, and collective learning. The group continued until they reached Elim, an oasis with 12 springs and 70 palm trees, where they found temporary rest. But as they ventured further into the desert of Sin, the lack of food sparked another outburst of discontent. The Israelites nostalgically remembered the meat pots of Egypt, forgetting the conditions of their slavery. In response, God announced he would provide food daily. This provision came in 2 forms. In the evening, flocks of quail descended on the camp. In the morning, a thin layer resembling frost covered the ground. When the people gathered it, they discovered an unfamiliar food, which they called manna, a term that literally means, "What is this?" The manna became their daily sustenance for 40 years, with precise instructions. Take only what is needed for each day, except before the Sabbath, when they could gather a double portion. The story preserves details about the social dynamics created by the manna. Some tried to store more than allowed and found that it spoiled the next day. Others went out to gather on the Sabbath and found nothing. These scenes reveal a process of discipline and dependence that shaped a people used to making decisions for immediate survival. The daily provision required constant trust that there would be food the next day. It was not just an act of sustenance, but a pedagogy aimed at transforming a recently freed multitude into a community with spiritual identity and social cohesion. Another challenge arose from the lack of water at Rephidim. Once again, the people complained to Moses and questioned whether God was truly with them. The tension reached the point where Moses feared being stoned. The story indicates that God instructed Moses to strike a rock at Horeb, from which water flowed to satisfy the entire community. The place was named Massah and Meribah, testing and quarreling, because there Israel tested God by asking if he was truly with them. The desert also brought the first military confrontation for the people after leaving Egypt. The Amalekites, a nomadic group accustomed to roaming the arid Sinai territory, attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses instructed Joshua to choose men for battle while he went up a hill with the staff of God. The story recounts that while Moses kept his hands raised, Israel prevailed, but when he lowered them, Amalek gained the advantage. Aaron and Hur held up his hands until sunset, allowing for victory. This episode marked the emergence of Joshua as a key military figure and revealed Israel's vulnerability to external attacks while it was being formed as a nation. During the journey, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, visited the camp and observed the burden Moses carried in resolving disputes and daily matters. He advised Moses to establish a system of judges and delegate responsibilities to capable leaders. This council introduced an early organization that would become the foundation of Israel's internal administration. The judicial structure allowed conflicts to be resolved and a growing community to be managed, preparing the people for a future with more complex laws. Despite its harshness, the desert was also a place of constant protection. The cloud guided the movements of the camp, and the pillar of fire illuminated the night. These signs accompanied Israel in every move, marking when to stop and when to advance. The idea that God dwelled in the midst of the people began to take root, preparing the ground for the most significant revelation they would experience in the next stage. Despite the miracles, complaints continued. Freedom brought uncertainty, and uncertainty generated fear. The people struggled between remembering the oppressive past and facing an unknown future. But in the midst of these tensions, the journey was leading them toward an encounter that would define their national identity: the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, the law that formed an identity. Israel arrived at the desert of Sinai in the 3rd month after leaving Egypt. That imposing and silent rocky massif became the setting for one of the most pivotal moments in the history of the people. The camp was set up at the foot of the mountain, and Moses ascended to receive divine instructions. The initial message established a fundamental framework. If Israel listened to the voice of God and kept his covenant, it would be a special people among all nations, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This declaration marked the first articulation of the collective destiny of the people, transforming a group of freed slaves into a community with a spiritual vocation and moral responsibility. The mountain began to prepare for the revelation. Moses descended and communicated the words he had received. The Israelites, with one unanimous voice, responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said." It was a solemn commitment before understanding its content. For 3 days, the people were instructed to purify themselves, wash their clothes, and abstain from certain activities to be prepared. Boundaries were set around the mountain. No one, neither man nor animal, was to touch it while the manifestation lasted. The physical boundary emphasized the idea of the sacred as a powerful and dangerous reality for anyone who approached without mediation. At dawn on the 3rd day, the mountain transformed into a breathtaking spectacle. Thunder, lightning, a thick cloud, and a trumpet sound that grew in intensity covered Sinai. The mountain shook, and the people gathered at the foot were overwhelmed by the magnitude of the phenomenon. Moses spoke, and the voice answered from the height. The scene merged natural elements with a theophanic experience, signaling the active and near presence of God. It was in this context that the 10 Commandments were spoken, words that would become the ethical and spiritual core of Israel. The commandments established 2 essential dimensions: the relationship of the people with God, which involved exclusivity, reverence, limits on the use of the divine name, and the observance of the Sabbath, and the relationship between individuals, which demanded honoring parents, prohibiting murder, adultery, theft, false testimony, and coveting. Unlike the legal codes of other ancient civilizations, these commandments did not merely regulate behavior. They defined a worldview where morality was directly linked to the identity of the people. Israel was to live differently because its God was different. The impact of the revelation was so profound that the Israelites, fearing death from the intensity of the divine voice, begged Moses to be the exclusive mediator. Moses ascended the mountain again, this time to receive detailed instructions about the religious, social, and civil life of the people. The chapters that followed in the biblical narrative contain a complex body of law: rules concerning worship, regulations for justice, laws on servitude, compensations, damages, crimes, and rituals. Each commandment was inserted into a framework designed to organize a community that would soon need specific rules for living in the Promised Land. Among these instructions, the construction of a portable sanctuary stood out, where the divine presence would dwell in the midst of the camp. This tabernacle would be the religious center of Israel for generations. Specific clothing for the priests, consecration rituals, and detailed instructions about sacred objects such as the Ark of the Covenant, the menorah, and the altar of incense were also specified. Each element had a function and significance, forming a system of worship distinct from that of neighboring peoples and deeply connected to the memory of the covenant. As Moses remained on the mountain, time passed without the people knowing how long the revelation would last. Seeing that their leader was taking too long to return, anxiety grew among the Israelites. The void of authority became a critical point, and the people asked Aaron to make them a visible image to guide them. Aaron agreed and gathered gold jewelry to mold a calf, a figure that reminded them of deities common in Egypt and Canaan. The image was presented as a symbol of their liberation from Egypt, and the people celebrated with a festival that combined sacrifices and ritual excess. On the mountain, God informed Moses of what had happened and announced his intention to destroy the people for their unfaithfulness. Moses interceded, appealing to the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His intercession was heard, and Moses descended with the tablets of the covenant written by God's hand. Upon seeing the calf and the revelry, he threw down the tablets and broke them at the foot of the mountain, a gesture symbolizing the breaking of the newly established covenant. He took the calf, burned it, ground it into powder, and forced the people to drink the water mixed with its remains. The episode exposed the spiritual fragility of Israel, but also highlighted Moses' role as the indispensable mediator. A judgment was carried out. The Levites punished those who had led the rebellion. Moses then ascended again to ask for forgiveness for the nation. He received new tablets, reaffirming the covenant despite the transgression. This renewal marked a new beginning, underscoring that God's purpose remained intact. The tabernacle, the presence of God among his people. After the renewal of the covenant at Sinai, the focus of the narrative shifted to a project that would mark the spiritual center of Israel for generations, the construction of the tabernacle. Unlike the stone temples that characterized ancient civilizations, this sanctuary would be portable, accompanying the people in each of their movements. Its main purpose was clear: to allow the divine presence to dwell in the midst of the camp, not in distant or inaccessible places, but at the very heart of the community. The instructions for its construction were detailed and strict. Moses received a specific design that had to be followed without deviation. The tabernacle was to consist of an acacia wood structure covered in gold, covered by fine linen curtains and skins, and surrounded by an atrium delineated by columns and curtains. Every measurement, material, and ornament had a functional and symbolic meaning. The Ark of the Covenant, which would be inside the Holy of Holies, was to be completely covered in gold, with two facing cherubim above a mercy seat. There, the divine presence would manifest between the extended wings of the cherubim. To carry out this project, exceptional craftsmen were chosen. The narrative mentions Bezalel and Oholiab, described as men filled with wisdom, skill, and artistic knowledge. Their abilities would encompass carpentry, metallurgy, weaving, and engraving. Alongside them, other artisans contributed embroidered fabrics, gold moldings, bronze utensils, and precious elements. The people, in turn, contributed materials: gold, silver, precious stones, linen, oils, and woods. These contributions were voluntary, and at one point, Moses had to order that no more materials be brought, as the amount gathered exceeded what was necessary. The tabernacle was organized into two main areas. The holy place housed three objects: the table of showbread, the seven-branched menorah, and the altar of incense. Each had a specific ritual function. The menorah was to burn continuously, symbolizing the light that does not go out. The table held 12 loaves, renewed each week, representing the 12 tribes. The altar of incense, in turn, scented the space, marking it as sacred. The Holy of Holies, separated by a veil woven with embroidered cherubim, contained the Ark of the Covenant. That veil, thick and magnificently woven, represented the barrier between the divine presence and humanity. Only the high priest could cross it once a year during Yom Kippur, bringing the blood of the sacrifice to atone for the people. This design emphasized both the closeness and the holiness of the divine presence. God dwelled among them, but access to that space required mediation and purification. Around the tabernacle was an outer court with the altar of burnt offering and the bronze laver. The altar, made of wood covered in bronze, was the place where the daily sacrifices were made. The laver was used by the priests to wash before officiating. All these structures formed a ritual system designed to order the spiritual life of the people and maintain their connection with the divine presence. The consecration of the priesthood was another central element. Aaron and his sons were designated as priests. Their garments included linen tunics, embroidered belts, breastplates adorned with 12 stones representing the tribes, and a gold plate on the forehead that read, "Holiness to the Lord." These details emphasized the dignity and responsibility of the office. The consecration ritual included sacrifices, anointing with oil, and the laying on of hands, marking the beginning of a religious leadership that would accompany Israel for centuries. When all the elements were completed, Moses inspected the work. Each structure, utensil, and fabric corresponded exactly to what had been instructed on the mountain. In a final act of dedication, Moses erected the tabernacle and placed the objects in their respective places. He kindled the fire on the altar, arranged the tables, and hung the veils. Then a moment occurred that marked the culmination of the project. The cloud that had guided Israel descended and covered the sanctuary. The divine glory filled the tabernacle to the point that Moses could not enter due to the intensity of that presence. From that day the cloud rested upon the tabernacle during the day, and the pillar of fire illuminated it by night. When the cloud lifted, the people moved forward. When it stayed, Israel camped. This pattern became the constant guide of the journey, emphasizing that they were not moving by strategic decision, but following a presence that marked their rhythms and rest. The narrative mentions additional rebellions during those years, such as that of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, who rose up against the authority of Moses and Aaron, arguing that the entire people were holy. The rebellion ended in immediate judgment, reinforcing that leadership was not the result of human ambition but of divine appointment. The death of Miriam also occurred, and shortly after, Aaron's death on Mount Hor, marking the end of key figures from the Exodus. Toward the end of the period, Moses made a mistake that would affect his own destiny. At Meribah, in response to complaints about a lack of water, he struck the rock to bring forth water, instead of speaking to it as he had been instructed. Though the water flowed, this act of disobedience excluded him from entering the promised land. The judgment even reached Israel's most faithful leader, demonstrating the seriousness of the covenant and the responsibility involved in guiding the people. Joshua and the arrival in Canaan, the fulfillment of the promise. After 4 decades in the desert, Israel was finally standing on the threshold of the promised land. The camp stretched across the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan River, from where the hills and valleys of Canaan could be seen. The generation that had left Egypt had almost entirely passed away. In its place, a new generation, formed in the discipline of the desert and the experience of the tabernacle, was preparing to enter the land promised to Abraham. Moses, now elderly, knew he would not cross the river. His mission was coming to an end. Before dying, Moses reaffirmed the law, gave speeches directed at the new generation, and blessed the tribes. Then he ascended Mount Nebo, where he gazed upon the expanse of Canaan, the fields of Jericho, the central mountains, and the fertile plains. From that point, the narrative shows him seeing what he would never set foot in. Moses died there, and his burial was shrouded in mystery, with no registered location that could become a place of worship. With his death, the era of the prophet who had guided the people from oppression in Egypt to the gates of the inheritance came to an end. Leadership then passed to Joshua, son of Nun, who had been Moses' assistant, a faithful companion, and one of the 2 spies who had trusted in the promise. His appointment was not improvised. Moses presented him to the people and the priesthood, laying hands on him and designating him as his successor. Furthermore, the narrative emphasizes that Joshua received the divine support necessary to lead the people into a stage that would require military strategy, spiritual fidelity, and determination. The journey to Canaan began with the need to cross the Jordan River, a river that during the harvest season overflowed and ran with great force. According to the account, the divine intervention that had marked the crossing of the Red Sea was once again manifested. Joshua ordered the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant to advance toward the river. When their feet touched the waters, the flow stopped upstream, leaving a dry path. The Israelites crossed in an orderly manner, while the priests remained in the middle of the riverbed until the entire nation had passed. Once on the other side, Joshua instructed them to take 12 stones from the river to serve as a memorial of the crossing. Those stones would become a reminder for future generations, symbolizing that, just as at the Red Sea, the people had crossed a decisive boundary through an act of divine intervention. With this gesture, the presence of Israel in Canaan began, though the actual possession of the territory would still require a series of conquests. The first challenge was Jericho, a fortified city whose walls impressed even the new generation of Israelites. Jericho controlled a strategic pass between the Jordan Valley and the Central Mountains. Before the confrontation, Joshua sent 2 spies into the city. There, a woman named Rahab, identified as a prostitute, hid them from the local authorities. Rahab expressed her conviction that Israel had divine protection and asked for protection for her family when the city was taken. The spies agreed to hang a red cord in her window as a sign of safeguard. The instructions for the fall of Jericho were unusual from a military perspective. For 6 days, the Israelites were to circle the city once each day, with the Ark of the Covenant and priests blowing trumpets while the people remained silent. On the 7th day, they were to circle it 7 times, and at the end, they were to give a great shout. According to the account, at the conclusion of the 7th circuit, the walls collapsed, allowing the army to enter. The city was taken, and Rahab and her family were spared as agreed. After the initial victory, Israel faced another significant episode in the city of Ai. The first attempt failed due to an act of disobedience within the camp. A man named Achan had taken forbidden spoils from Jericho. Only after Achan was identified and punished did the military campaign restart successfully. This episode highlighted a principle that would shape the conquests. Israel's progress depended on their faithfulness, not just their military strength. The biblical narrative shows that during the campaigns, Joshua and the leaders of the people established covenants, fought battles, and took possession of strategic cities in the mountains, the plains, and the south of Canaan. A notable episode occurred in Gibeon, where certain inhabitants resorted to deception to avoid being conquered. They presented themselves in worn clothes and with old bread, pretending to come from distant lands. Israel made a covenant without consulting the priesthood, committing to not destroy them. Later, when the truth came to light, the Gibeonites were assigned as workers for the sanctuary. This incident revealed the need for discernment and the importance of spiritual consultation in military and political decision-making. During these campaigns, the narrative highlights the figure of Joshua as a leader guided by both strategy and obedience. A coalition of Canaanite kings joined forces to attack Gibeon, and Joshua came to its defense. In the battle recorded in the valley of Ajalon, Israel achieved a decisive victory, accentuated by an extraordinary phenomenon described in an ancient poem that suggests the prolongation of the day to allow the complete defeat of the enemy. This account, though poetic in form, underscores the central idea. The conquest was not the result of human strength, but of divine accompaniment that manifested in extraordinary ways. Over time, the campaigns resulted in control of vast areas of the land, though the complete conquest would be a prolonged process that would extend beyond Joshua's life. The tribes received their assigned territories through a system of distribution organized in assemblies held at Shiloh, where the tabernacle had been set up. Israel thus began a new phase as a settled people, with territory, laws, and consolidated leadership. Joshua, now elderly, gathered the people to exhort them to faithfulness. He reminded them of the Exodus, the desert, and the victories they had gained. Then he died at the age of 110, bringing to an end the transitional period between the promise and its initial fulfillment.